The wind whispered low across the dry grasslands, stirring dust along the fence posts like old ghosts on the move. Mabel Kerrigan sat alone on the porch, wrapped in a faded shawl, her fingers curled around a tin mug long gone cold. The rocking chair creaked beneath her slight frame, the only sound save for the occasional snort from the mule in the paddock. The sky above was moon-silvered and vast, casting long, lonesome shadows across the land she and John had carved from wilderness. 5 years. That's how long it had been since he rode out. He left at dusk, saddlebag packed light, rifle slung across his back. Cattle thieves had taken 3 steers in a single night, and John, proud, stubborn, protective, refused to wait for the sheriff. "Be back by supper," he'd said with a half-grin and a hand on her cheek. She hadn't smiled back. The plains had been restless that summer, and the men who stole livestock didn't stop there. She'd watched him disappear into the haze of twilight, a silhouette swallowed by the horizon. Sometime deep in the night, she heard it. One shot, far off but sharp, like the sky had cracked. She bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, eyes fixed to the open window. The silence afterward was heavier than the noise. She waited, listening, holding her breath until dawn's first light crept across the hills. Dusty, John's loyal hound, limped into the yard at sunrise, muzzle torn, ribs showing, eyes wide with something not quite fear and not quite sorrow. But John never came. They searched for 2 weeks. A few neighbors, a grizzled deputy from Los Alamos, even a tracker from the Pueblo. No sign. No blood, no tracks. Just the plains, vast and indifferent. Some whispered that John had run off. Others said he'd picked the wrong fight. Mabel stayed. She kept the land, buried her grief in chores, and listened every night for hoofbeats that never came. Dusty stayed close after that, guarding the house like he was waiting too. Then one winter, the dog wandered off and didn't return. She figured he'd gone to die under some distant tree, the way animals did when they knew their time was done. But tonight, everything changed. It was near midnight when she heard the scratching, slow, uncertain, at the edge of the porch. She stepped outside with her lantern, shotgun in hand. Her breath caught when she saw him. Dusty stood in the pale light, older, grayer, eyes dim but fixed on her with eerie purpose. His coat was matted with mud and something darker. He staggered forward, collapsed near the steps, and tried to stand again. She rushed to him, dropping the shotgun to her side. "Dusty," she whispered, touching his flank. His fur was sticky. Blood. Not his. His wounds were old, mostly healed over. But the blood was fresh, still warm. Then she saw it, clutched in his teeth, half covered by grime and burrs. A spur. Not just any spur. She would have known it in the dark, in her sleep, in a storm. It was John's. The left one. Custom made by a blacksmith in Santa Fe, with a flattened rose pattern welded into the shank. Her hand shook as she pried it from the dog's mouth. The metal was cracked. Dried blood crusted the leather strap. She sat back on her heels, breath caught in her chest. Dusty let out a low whine and laid his head on her knee. The night around them stretched quiet and wide, but her world had narrowed to the battered hound and the bloodstained sign from a past she'd tried not to hope for. John was out there, or he had been. Something twisted in her gut. Not fear, not yet. It was the return of something more dangerous. A sliver of belief. She stood, slow and stiff from years of tending fences and lifting buckets instead of dancing or dreaming. The wind had turned colder. The porch boards groaned under her step as she carried the spur inside and placed it gently on the table. Dusty dragged himself in behind her, curling up by the fire like he'd never left. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat beside the window, lamp turned low, watching the dark roll across the hills. The prairie never answered questions, not directly, but sometimes it returned what was taken, changed, wounded, and bearing secrets. She didn't know who had bled, didn't know how far the dog had traveled, but something in her bones, the part of her that once could shoot a silver coin from a tossed hat at 50 paces, told her the time, for waiting had passed. Morning would come, and when it did, she would follow. Mabel woke before dawn, the chill seeping through the thin walls of the cabin biting at her skin. Dusty lay curled at the foot of the bed, his breath shallow but steady. She reached out, running a calloused hand over his grizzled fur, feeling the slight heat of his body beneath her fingers. The blood on his coat had dried, flaking in places like old leather, but the smell lingered, a sharp, coppery tang that clawed at her senses. It was a scent she couldn't ignore. The morning sun spilled gold across the rutted dirt road outside, casting long shadows through the cottonwoods. Mabel dressed quickly in worn trousers and a faded blouse, fastening the belt John had given her years ago, the one with the silver buckle she'd polished every week, as if it held her hope inside. She wrapped a heavy coat around her shoulders, grabbed the rifle from the corner, and stepped outside. Dusty rose unsteadily, nudging her hand with his muzzle, his eyes bright with an urgency she hadn't seen since John's disappearance. He limped toward the barn, then paused, glancing back as if urging her to follow. Mabel didn't hesitate. The dog was a living thread to a past she refused to let go. They crossed the parched fields, the grass brittle underfoot, and wound their way toward the brush-covered arroyo behind the ranch. The air smelled of earth and sagebrush, heavy with the promise of rain but stubbornly dry for now. The dog's pace was slow, deliberate, each step measured against the cracked ground. Mabel's mind drifted briefly to the years before John, to when she had been known as Silver Mabel, a sharpshooter in a traveling show. She had traded the roar of the crowd for the quiet of the plains, burying her old life beneath layers of dust and chores. John had called her fierce once, a wild spirit tamed by love and land. Now that fire flickered again, fed by the mystery that had walked back into her life on four legs. As they approached the dry creek bed, Dusty stopped abruptly, nose to the wind. Mabel scanned the horizon. Jagged cliffs and twisted junipers framed the empty sky. Then she saw it. Faint tracks in the dust, hoof prints pressed deep, leading toward a narrow canyon where the shadows pooled thick. The prints were fresh. Not just horses, something heavier dragged between them. She knelt, brushing loose dirt from the edge of a worn leather strap tangled in the scrub. The letters J.K. were stamped faintly into the cracked hide. Her breath caught. Mabel stood, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The tracks disappeared into the canyon's mouth, like a secret waiting to be unearthed. She adjusted her coat, tightened her grip on the rifle, and followed. The canyon walls rose steep and rough, blotting out the sun and turning the air cold. The silence here was different, thicker, charged. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves echoed like a gunshot. Dusty led, sniffing, alert despite his wounds. After a time, they came upon a sight that made Mabel's blood run cold. A wagon lay wrecked, its wheels shattered and half buried in sand. The canvas covering was burned and torn, blackened bones scattered nearby. A rusted lockbox lay abandoned under a fallen beam, corroded beyond hope. Yet it was the saddle, slumped against a boulder, that stopped her cold. It was John's. The leather was dry and brittle, but the initials she'd branded into the skirt years ago were unmistakable. The stirrups, the worn patches where he had rested his knees, all there, frozen in time. She ran her hand along the horn, as if she might feel the ghost of his grip. Beneath the saddle, half hidden beneath stones, Mabel's fingers brushed against something else. She pulled out a small, weathered journal. The leather cover was cracked, pages yellowed but intact. Her heart thundered as she opened it, fingers trembling. The handwriting was unmistakable, John's careful script, fading but clear. The first entry spoke of long rides and restless nights, of cattle tracks and campfires. But as she read further, the tone darkened. He wrote of a gang calling themselves the Black Gulch Riders, 5 men who terrorized the territory, stealing stock, killing without mercy. John had sworn to stop them. He had tracked their raids, followed their trails into the wild canyons, leaving notes for her to find in case of trouble. In the final entry, dated just days before he vanished, John wrote, "They caught me tonight. Took Dusty. They don't know she bites." Mabel's breath caught in her throat. The dog's return wasn't a blessing, it was a warning. She closed the journal, pressing it to her chest as Dusty whimpered softly beside her. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the walls closing in with the weight of secrets. Somewhere beyond the rocks, the Black Gulch Riders still lurked, their shadows stretched long by a past that refused to die. Mabel looked down at Dusty, his eyes bright despite pain. He had survived for her. Now, it was her turn to face the dust and blood of the frontier, to track down the men who had stolen her husband and the dog who had carried their last hope. With a steadying breath, she tucked the journal into her coat and started back toward the open plains, the rising sun burning away the shadows, but leaving the questions alive. This journey was just beginning. Mabel crested the ridge by late afternoon, her eyes scanning the jagged horizon where the rocks turned red and the land opened into a jagged bowl known as Black Gulch. It was a cruel, broken place. Twisted cedars jutting from rock faces like claws, the wind howling low through the chasm like it mourned something long buried. Stories had circled about this gulch for years, whispers of ambushes, of travelers who never returned. Most decent folks gave it a wide berth, but Mabel Kerrigan wasn't feeling decent anymore. She was feeling old. She was feeling ready. Dusty moved slowly beside her, panting, his sides heaving with effort, but his nose stayed low to the earth, following a scent only he could read. Whatever he'd fled from, he was willing to return. That meant more to her than any sign. The rifle hung heavy on her back, but her fingers twitched ready. She hadn't fired it in over a year, hadn't needed to. But muscle memory didn't forget. Not hers. Silver Mabel had put bullets through Nichols-tossed Madare, once bested a Confederate scout at 200 yards with a borrowed pistol. She wasn't about to forget now. She found their camp before the sun fell. They'd chosen a hollow just below a rock ledge, a cluster of stunted trees offering the only shade for miles. 5 horses were tethered among the scrub. She counted 3 men, 2 moving around a smoky fire, 1 perched on a crate, cleaning his boots with a bloody cloth. They were filthy, hard-eyed, dressed in piecemeal gear that spoke of many towns, none of them peaceful. Mabel crouched low behind a boulder and watched. Dusty whined softly beside her, ears flat. He recognized them. She could see it in the way his body tensed. She shifted slightly, peering through the brush. One man, the tallest, wore a wide-brimmed black hat and a coat that sagged with the weight of whatever he'd stuffed in its pockets. Another had a scar running down his jawline like a canyon split. The third, the boot cleaner, laughed, holding something up between 2 fingers. A necklace. A thin leather cord with a carved piece of wood at its end. Her breath hitched. John had carved that charm their first year together, when the nights were cold, and he still called her darling. Without thinking twice, she had tied it to her saddle horn, then later tucked it in John's pocket before his last ride. They had killed him. Or worse. The rage that bloomed in her chest was cold, not hot. Focused. She checked the chamber of her rifle. 5 rounds. The 6th she kept for Dusty. Not for him to take, no. But just in case she needed one more shot, and he couldn't run. She waited until the men spread out. 1 by the fire, 1 feeding the horses, 1 slipping into the rocks to relieve himself. The camp loosened. That was their mistake. Mabel moved like a whisper. Down the slope. Along the edge of the gulch, where the wind masked her steps. She slid behind a downed log, just 50 yards from the fire. The rifle came up steady. The scar-jawed man looked up, confused, right before the bullet found the space between his eyes. The one by the fire spun, drawing, but she was faster. A second shot cracked the silence, sending him sprawling over the flames, gun tumbling into the coals. The third man shouted from the rocks and ducked for cover. Mabel moved again, circling wide through the scrub, keeping low. She heard his boots scrape, heard the sharp click of a revolver hammer. She waited behind a rise, counted to 3. Then she threw a stone hard to the left. He popped out on reflex. Her third shot caught him in the throat. He dropped like a rag, legs twitching. Silence returned. Only the wind and the crackle of a dying fire remained. She approached slowly, rifle at the ready. Dusty followed, snarling now, low and deep. They circled the camp. The scar-jawed man still twitched faintly, trying to crawl away, a smear of red behind him. She stepped over him, calm. "You had a husband once," he gasped, voice bubbling through blood. He begged. She looked him dead in the eye and didn't say a word. The 4th shot ended him. She found the charm in the dirt beside the fire and held it tightly for a long moment, until her fingers cramped. Then she searched the camp. No sign of John's body. No graves. No journal. Nothing but stolen goods, worn saddles, and dried blood. But in one of the saddlebags, beneath a rusted knife and a coil of rope, she found something she hadn't expected. A folded map, old and smudged, marked with crude black crosses. One cross sat just beyond the gulch, near a dry spring she knew from old cattle runs. And next to it, in a rough scrawl, the words, "Kerrigan, buried deep." She stared at it, pulse rising. Buried, but not forgotten. She wrapped the map and stuffed it inside her coat, then poured the gang's water skins out on the ground, leaving them to the vultures. When she turned to leave, Dusty stood already facing the rising moon, tail low, but his body ready to move. She touched his head gently. "Come on," she said. "One more ride." And together they vanished into the deepening dark. The dry spring sat nestled in a hollow between sun-bleached ridges. The earth cracked like old pottery, and the rocks scorched by years of merciless sun. Mabel reached it by mid-morning, Dusty limping beside her, his strength running thin. The silence here was heavy. So still it felt like the land itself held its breath, waiting. She dismounted from the borrowed horse she'd taken from the outlaw camp and walked the last few paces. Her shadow stretched over the brittle ground as she unrolled the map once more. The cross was marked beneath a ridge shaped like a crooked tooth, and there it was, jetting out from the slope like it had been watching her all along. She climbed slowly, her boots kicking dust down the slope, and began to search. There were no headstones, no markers, just dry stone and shallow soil. She worked with her hands, scraping at the earth, clearing brush and digging with a rusted spade she'd strapped to her saddle. Dusty sat nearby, watching silent. Hours passed. Then the earth shifted. Her hand struck something solid, wood, splintered and worn. She cleared it gently, heart pounding as she revealed the edge of a pine box. No name was carved on it, just initials J.K., burned into the wood with the same careful hand that once carved her a charm. Mabel sat back on her heels, staring at the casket, her breath shallow. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up years ago, when hope still dared visit her. Now, she felt only a hollow ache, and beneath it, something sharper, like pride. She pried open the lid. The skeleton inside wore remnants of a cavalry coat. The bones of a hand still gripped a six-shooter, the cylinder rusted tight. Around the neck, resting against ribs long stripped of flesh, hung her charm. John had gone down fighting. She touched the charm, lips tight. Then she stood. The ridge carried her voice like a ghost when she spoke. "They thought they buried a man," she said aloud, voice dry and even. "But they planted a reckoning." She lit a small fire and burned what was left of the map, the journal, and the outlaw's name scratched inside. Let no other soul come hunting ghosts here. She buried the box again, deep and firm, and placed a circle of stones atop it. Then she carved one word into the largest rock with her knife. Husband. Not John. Not Kerrigan. Just what he'd been to her. Dusty whined softly as she returned to him. She knelt beside him, burying her fingers in his fur. "It's done," she whispered. "You brought me home." That night, they camped beneath the stars. No fire, no sound but the wind. Mabel stared into the sky, her rifle beside her, her past finally laid to rest beneath 6 feet of dirt and memory. Dusty slept with his head on her boots. She left the gulch before dawn. But stories don't stay buried in the frontier. Months passed, then years. And still, folks talked. They said an old widow rode into Black Gulch and wiped out a gang of 5 with a rifle older than sin. Said she tracked them by blood, by dog, by rage. Said the last one died crying for mercy, and she gave him none. Some claimed she'd once been a legend in the shooting shows, faster than any man west of the Missouri. Others said she was a ghost, sent by her dead husband to clean the land with fire and lead. Children in dusty towns played games pretending to be Widow Kerrigan, aiming sticks and shouting vengeance into the wind. Old men tipped their hats when they spoke her name, quiet-like, as if she might still be listening. But she never returned to town. She was last seen heading north, dog at her side, eyes set on a place no one else could see. maybe peace, maybe more justice. No one knows where she rests now, but in the hills and hollows of the West, when the wind kicks up just right, folks swear they hear a woman's voice whisper through the sage. "You had a husband once," he begged. And they ride a little faster,